The moon hung high above the decrepit silhouette of the Blackthorn Hotel, its crumbling facade a grim invitation to the brave or the foolish. The locals whispered tales of its haunted corridors, warning anyone who dared cross its ivy-choked threshold. But for thrill-seekers like Elena and her friends, such warnings were part of the allure. They arrived just past dusk, their laughter masking a growing unease as they pushed open the creaking double doors. A gust of cold air rushed to meet them, carrying with it the faint scent of mildew and something far worse, something metallic and sharp, like blood. The lobby was an eerie blend of faded grandeur and suffocating neglect. Dust danced in the pale light of their flashlights, and the chandelier above groaned with every subtle shift of the building. Elena took the lead, her camera ready to capture evidence of the supernatural. Behind her, Ryan joked about ghost hunters, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. Mia stayed close, her arms wrapped around herself as if warding off an invisible chill. And then there was Sam, the skeptic, who dismissed every creak and shadow as the product of an old, unstable building. Their plan was simple: spend the night exploring the infamous hotel and document any signs of the paranormal. They had barely made it past the lobby when the first unsettling occurrence stopped them in their tracks. A grand piano, warped by time, sat against one wall. Its keys, yellowed and cracked, were silent as they passed. But as they turned toward the staircase, a single haunting note rang out, clear and deliberate. Ryan spun around, his flashlight sweeping the room. "Probably just a loose string," he muttered, though his voice wavered. Sam nodded, eager to back up his claim, but Mia's face had gone pale. "Let's keep moving," Elena said, her tone more confident than she felt. They climbed the staircase, each step groaning under their weight. The second floor was worse. The walls were lined with faded portraits, their subjects' faces obscured by mold and grime. Yet as the group moved past, it felt as if unseen eyes followed their every move. At the end of the corridor, room 217 awaited them. It was the hotel's most infamous room, where, according to legend, a maid had been found dead under mysterious circumstances, her body contorted as if in agony. Elena pushed open the door, and a wave of dread washed over them. The room was eerily untouched, as if frozen in time. A four-poster bed dominated the space, its linens yellowed with age. The faint impression of a body seemed pressed into the mattress, as though someone or something had only recently vacated it. They set up their equipment, trying to ignore the oppressive silence. Ryan placed an EMF reader on the nightstand, while Mia lit a single candle, its flickering flame casting grotesque shadows on the peeling wallpaper. Sam leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "This is ridiculous," he said. "There's nothing here, but..." The door slammed shut behind them. Mia screamed, and the candle went out, plunging the room into darkness. Panic erupted as they fumbled for their flashlights, but when the beams finally pierced the gloom, they were not alone. In the far corner of the room stood a figure, a woman in a maid's uniform, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow pits of darkness. Her lips twisted into a ghastly smile as she began to move toward them, her limbs jerking unnaturally, as if pulled by invisible strings. Ryan bolted for the door, yanking at the handle, but it refused to budge. Elena snapped photo after photo, her hands shaking. The flash briefly illuminated the apparition, each burst revealing her decayed features in horrifying detail. "This isn't real," Sam whispered, but his voice cracked, betraying his fear. The maid stopped inches from Mia, who was frozen in place, tears streaming down her face. The ghost tilted her head, her smile widening, and then she spoke in a voice that seemed to echo from the walls themselves. "You came to see me. Stay." The room erupted in chaos. Furniture flew across the room, the walls trembled, and an ear-splitting wail filled the air. The group huddled together, screaming until the door finally burst open, as if thrown by some unseen force. They didn't hesitate. One by one, they stumbled into the hallway, their footsteps pounding against the floorboards as they fled. When they reached the lobby, they found the front doors wide open, the night air beckoning them to safety. They didn't look back as they ran to their car and sped away, their hearts pounding and their breaths ragged. Weeks later, Elena reviewed the footage on her camera. Most of the photos were blurred, distorted by the frenzy of the night. But one image stood out. A crystal-clear shot of the maid standing at the foot of the bed, her hollow eyes staring directly into the lens. and behind her, barely visible in the shadows, were dozens of faces, each one contorted in silent screams. The Blackthorn Hotel still stands, its doors forever open to those curious enough, or reckless enough, to enter. But no one who leaves ever truly escapes. They carry a piece of it with them, a lingering whisper of despair that follows them into the night. For the Blackthorn is not just haunted, it is alive, and it hungers for more.
Story number 2.
The town of Hollow Pines had long since abandoned the St. Grendel Hotel, letting it rot in the shadow of the forest. Built a century ago as a grand escape for the wealthy, it now stood as a cursed monument to a tragedy no one dared speak of. The few who ventured near the property swore they heard faint laughter, the clinking of glasses and soft piano music drifting from its broken windows. But everyone knew St. Grendel's was empty, except for the dead. Chris, Nadine, and Marco, amateur urban explorers with a penchant for the macabre, decided they had to see the place for themselves. The legends were too wild to ignore. Stories of disappearing guests, of the walls bleeding, of faces appearing in cracked mirrors. It was a buffet of fear. Armed with flashlights, cameras, and Marco's self-proclaimed ghost radar, the trio set off late one October night, their breath fogging in the chilly air. The hotel loomed ahead, its once pristine white walls stained with time, and its grand entrance overtaken by gnarled vines. A stone fountain in the front courtyard had cracked in half, its angel centerpiece now leering with moss-covered malice. As they crossed the threshold, the air seemed to change, thicker, colder, pressing against their chests. The lobby was massive, with a chandelier that hung precariously, its crystals coated in grime. The floor was a patchwork of broken tiles, and the desk, once manned by cheerful clerks, was now a haven for cobwebs. A guest book still lay open, though its pages were yellowed and brittle. Nadine brushed off the dust and squinted at the last entry. Mr. and Mrs. Fenton, room 303. Creepy, she muttered, snapping a picture. Maybe they're still here, Marco joked, though his laugh was uneasy. They started up the grand staircase, each step groaning beneath their weight. The walls were lined with portraits, their subjects' faces obscured by grime except for the eyes, which seemed startlingly clear and eerily focused on them. Chris stopped to inspect one, a man in a bowler hat, and shuddered. "It's like he's watching us," he said. Nadine rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress a shiver. "Let's just find room 303. When they reached the third floor, the air grew colder still, and the faint strains of a piano drifted down the hallway. They froze. "Tell me you heard that," Chris whispered. Marco pointed his ghost radar down the corridor, its screen flickering wildly. "Definitely something here," he said, with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. Room 303 was at the end of the hall. Its door was slightly ajar, revealing a slice of darkness. Nadine pushed it open, the hinges letting out a wail. The room was disturbingly pristine, untouched by the decay that consumed the rest of the hotel. The bed was made, the curtains hung neatly, and a vase of fresh roses sat on the nightstand, their scent sickly sweet. "This isn't right," Chris muttered. Marco took out his camera and began filming, his voice trembling as he narrated their findings. "We've entered room 303. Everything's perfect. No dust, no decay, like someone still lives here." As if in response, the door slammed shut. They jumped, spinning toward the sound, but there was no one there. The temperature plummeted. Their breaths came in visible puffs, and the faint sound of laughter echoed around them. "Okay, we're leaving," Nadine said, pulling at the door. It wouldn't budge. Then the roses in the vase began to wilt, their petals shriveling and blackening before their eyes. A low whisper filled the room, rising to a cacophony of voices, all speaking over one another. Words were impossible to make out, but the tone was unmistakable. Anger. The mirror above the dresser fogged over, and letters began to scrawl across it as if written by an invisible hand. "Stay with us." Chris screamed and threw his flashlight at the mirror. It shattered, revealing not the wall behind it, but a yawning void. From the darkness, pale, skeletal hands reached out, clawing at the air. Marco dropped his camera as one hand latched onto his wrist, pulling him closer to the mirror. "Help me," he screamed, but the others were frozen in terror. Nadine snapped out of her trance and grabbed Marco, pulling with all her strength. The hands retreated, leaving him with jagged cuts across his arm. The room erupted in chaos. The bed frame twisted and groaned. The walls bled a dark, viscous liquid, and the whispers turned to screams. Chris threw himself against the door, and this time it gave way. They bolted down the hallway, their footsteps drowned out by the cacophony behind them. The piano music returned, faster now, more frantic, chasing them as they fled. They didn't stop running until they were outside, gasping for air. The hotel loomed behind them, silent once more, its broken windows staring like dead eyes. Marco checked his camera, hoping to review the footage, but the device was dead, its screen cracked. That night, none of them slept. Marco woke screaming, clawing at his arms, claiming he felt hands pulling him into darkness. Nadine began hearing faint whispers whenever she was alone. Chris refused to speak of what he'd seen in the mirror before it shattered. The St. Grendel Hotel stood as it always had, waiting for its next visitors. But the three friends learned the hard way that not all places can be explored. Some are meant to be left alone, because the dead don't take kindly to visitors, and they're always looking for more company.
Story number 3.
The Marrowlight Inn was a place people passed but never stopped at. A solitary building perched at the edge of a cliff overlooking a churning black sea. The inn's single window glowed faintly like an unblinking eye, and the sign above its door creaked in the wind, bearing its name in faded, jagged letters. Locals swore it had been abandoned for decades, yet the light never went out. Gina and her boyfriend Mark weren't locals. Road-weary and lost after hours of driving through an unrelenting storm, they spotted the inn's faint glow and decided to take their chances. The GPS had stopped working, and the woods around them felt oppressive, as though the towering trees leaned closer with each passing minute. When they pulled up to the inn, their headlights barely cut through the heavy rain. "Looks creepy as hell," Mark said, gripping the steering wheel. "But it's dry," Gina countered, "and we don't have a choice." The rain intensified as they approached the door, its weathered wood cold beneath Gina's hand. To their surprise, it swung open easily, revealing a dimly lit lobby. It smelled faintly of salt and mildew, and the floorboards creaked under their weight. A man emerged from the shadows behind the counter, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes like polished glass marbles. His smile was too wide, his teeth too perfect. "Welcome to the Marrowlight Inn," he said, his voice low and velvety. "Checking in?" Mark hesitated, glancing at Gina. "Yeah, just for the night." The man slid a thick, leather-bound ledger across the counter. "Sign here," he said, his long fingers tapping the pen as if he couldn't wait. Gina scrawled their names without a second thought, eager to escape the chill. The man handed them a tarnished brass key. "Room 7, he said, gesturing to a staircase that spiraled upward, its banister carved with unsettling, twisting shapes. The room was small but clean, its decor frozen in time. Heavy curtains blocked the storm outside, and an antique lamp cast a sickly yellow glow. The bed looked inviting, but something about the room felt wrong. Gina couldn't pinpoint it. Perhaps it was the silence, so complete that it pressed against her ears like cotton. As they settled in, Mark's unease grew. "I don't like this place," he muttered, pacing near the window. "It's just old," Gina replied, though she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The first strange occurrence came after midnight. Gina woke to the sound of whispers, soft, overlapping voices, as though a dozen people were speaking at once. She nudged Mark awake. "Do you hear that?" He listened, his face paling. "Yeah, it's coming from outside." They opened the curtains to find the cliff bathed in an eerie, pale light. Dozens of figures stood at the edge, their silhouettes black against the glowing sea. None of them moved. "Jesus," Mark whispered. "What the hell are they doing?" The light flickered, and the figures turned as one, their faces blank, ovals of flesh. Gina screamed, letting the curtains fall closed. "We're leaving," Mark said, grabbing their bag. But when they opened the door, the hallway was different. The staircase was gone, replaced by a long, dark corridor lined with doors. Each door bore a number, but none of them matched the ones from before. "This isn't right," Gina whispered, clutching Mark's arm. "We'll find another way out," he said, though his voice was unsteady. They picked a direction and ran, but the corridor seemed endless. The numbers on the doors grew higher. Room 21, room 43, room 78, until they lost all meaning. The whispers followed them, growing louder, closer, as though the walls themselves were speaking. Finally, they stopped at a door marked Exit. Mark flung it open, and they found themselves back in the lobby. The pale man stood behind the counter, his smile now a grotesque leer. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice dripping with mockery. Gina bolted for the front door, but when she opened it, she froze. Instead of the stormy night, the outside world was gone. The doorway opened onto an abyss, a swirling void of pale light and shadow. The whispers roared, deafening now, as unseen hands pulled her forward. Mark grabbed her, yanking her back into the room. "What is this place?" He screamed at the man, who only laughed, a sound like glass shattering. "This is the Marrowlight Inn," he said, stepping around the counter. "You checked in, and no one ever checks out." The pale man's form began to change, his limbs elongating, his face splitting open like a cracked shell. Inside, rows of jagged teeth glistened, and hollow sockets gazed hungrily at them. Mark and Gina ran, but the inn had twisted itself beyond recognition. Rooms opened into nothingness, staircases spiraled endlessly, and every corridor led them back to the lobby. The whispers grew into screams, voices begging, crying, laughing, and cursing. When they finally collapsed in exhaustion, the pale man, or what he had become, stood over them. "Don't worry," he crooned. "You'll get used to it." They all do. The next morning, a faint light still glowed from the Marrowlight Inn. A new couple, soaked from the rain, approached its weathered door, drawn by its promise of shelter. And inside, the ledger awaited their names, while the whispers of Mark and Gina joined the chorus of the lost.
Story number 4.
The Ashen Hollow Motel had a reputation for swallowing people whole. Locals told stories of travelers who stopped there for the night and were never seen again. It stood on the edge of a forgotten highway, its faded sign flickering sporadically in the dark. No one in the nearby town of Reading dared approach it after sundown. But Nathan, a freelance journalist chasing strange urban legends, thought the rumors made for a great story. It was a cold, moonless night when Nathan arrived, his old sedan kicking up gravel as he pulled into the empty lot. The motel's exterior was cracked and weathered, its once cheerful yellow paint now peeling in grayish strips. A single bulb above the office door buzzed faintly, casting long shadows that seemed to twist and writhe. He stepped into the office, greeted by the stale scent of mildew and the hum of a dying fluorescent light. Behind the counter sat a woman with unnaturally bright eyes and a stiff, mechanical smile. She didn't blink as Nathan approached. "Just for one night," he said, trying to ignore the unsettling stillness of the room. The woman nodded without speaking, sliding a key across the counter. It was attached to a brass tag that read Room 8. Her smile didn't waver as he took it. "Thanks," Nathan said awkwardly, retreating quickly. The room was no better than the rest of the motel. The wallpaper hung in damp strips, the bed sagged in the middle, and the overhead light flickered intermittently. Still, it was late, and the thought of returning to the highway wasn't appealing. He set up his laptop on the rickety desk and began typing notes about the motel's history. The first oddity occurred around midnight. A scratching sound came from the wall behind him, faint but persistent. He turned, expecting to see signs of mice, but the wall was bare. Shrugging it off, he went back to work. Moments later, the scratching started again, this time louder, more deliberate, like fingernails dragging against wood. Nathan stood, running his hand along the wall. "What the hell?" he muttered. The light overhead flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness for a brief moment. When it came back on, something was different. The bed, which had been neatly made when he arrived, now appeared disheveled. The imprint of a body lay on the mattress, as if someone had just been lying there. Nathan's pulse quickened. He grabbed his phone and started recording. "If anyone's here, I'm not looking for trouble," he said, his voice shaky. The scratching stopped. The room was eerily silent. Then, from behind him, came a slow, deliberate creak, the sound of the closet door opening. Nathan turned, his flashlight beam trembling as it illuminated the dark interior of the closet. It was empty, but as he moved closer, he noticed something chilling. Scratch marks, deep and erratic, lined the inside walls of the closet. They were accompanied by faint smudges that looked disturbingly like handprints. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, nearly catching his fingers. He stumbled back, heart racing, and fumbled for the room key, intent on leaving. But when he turned toward the door, it was gone. The wall where it had been was now solid, seamless, as if the door had never existed. Panic set in as the room began to change. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a rhythmic, almost living quality. The air grew thick, heavy with the smell of rot. Nathan pressed himself against the corner, his phone still recording. The bed shifted, its frame groaning as something crawled out from beneath it. First a hand, gnarled and gray, its fingers unnaturally long. Then came the head, a grotesque, eyeless face with a mouth that stretched far too wide. The creature pulled itself forward, its movements jerky and unnatural, its head twitching as if searching for him. Nathan screamed, dropping his phone as he tried to climb onto the desk. The creature's head snapped toward the sound, and it let out a guttural, wheezing moan. It scuttled forward on all fours, its limbs bending in ways that made Nathan's stomach churn. He threw the desk chair at it, but the creature didn't flinch. Its mouth opened wider, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and from its throat came a sound like metal scraping against bone. Nathan scrambled onto the bed, his hands searching desperately for anything he could use as a weapon. His fingers closed around the brass key, and he hurled it at the creature. For a moment it paused, its eyeless face tilting as if confused. Then it lunged. Nathan felt a cold, clammy hand close around his ankle. He kicked wildly, his screams echoing in the claustrophobic room. The walls pulsed faster, the breathing sound almost deafening now. The creature dragged him toward the closet, its strength inhuman. "No!" he shouted, clawing at the bed frame, but it was useless. The closet door opened on its own, revealing not the cramped interior he'd seen earlier, but a black void, swirling and alive with faint whispers. The last thing Nathan saw before he was pulled into the darkness was his phone, lying on the floor, its screen cracked but still recording. The next morning, the Ashen Hollow Motel stood silent and empty once again. The office light flickered weakly, and roommate's door hung slightly ajar. On the desk inside, Nathan's phone continued to record, its battery inexplicably full. The footage would later be found by a passing traveler who dared to investigate. It ended with a close-up of the closet, its door swinging slowly shut. And in the final frame, just before the screen went black, the faint reflection of Nathan's terrified face could be seen staring back, his eyes glassy and lifeless.
Story number 5.
The Crimson Pines Resort was supposed to be a paradise. Built deep in the heart of an ancient forest, it boasted luxury cabins, crystal-clear lakes, and the allure of seclusion. But the resort closed abruptly 5 years after opening. No one spoke of why. Some claimed financial failure, others whispered about something far worse. For Evelyn, a struggling travel vlogger, the mystery of Crimson Pines was irresistible. She needed content that would set her apart, something that would bring in views and save her failing channel. So, armed with her camera, a flashlight, and a tent, she set out for the resort one late autumn evening. The main lodge was the first thing she saw through the thick trees. A massive wooden structure with a peaked roof, its windows broken and walls covered in creeping ivy. The air around the building felt heavier, quieter. Even the wind seemed to stop at its borders. Creepy as hell. Evelyn muttered to her camera, her voice the only sound as she pushed open the splintered front doors. The lobby was a cavernous space, its grand chandelier now a webbed tangle of broken glass and rusted metal. Dust coated everything, and the faint smell of decay lingered in the air. She scanned her flashlight over the abandoned furniture, stopping when the beam caught a large, circular stain in the center of the wooden floor. "Blood?" she whispered. As she knelt to inspect it, she heard a faint sound, like footsteps, above her. She froze, her flashlight trembling. "Hello?" she called out. Her voice echoed in the emptiness, but there was no response. She decided to explore the upper floors. The stairs groaned under her weight, each step feeling like a test of her courage. The second floor was lined with guest rooms, their doors hanging ajar. Most were empty, save for the occasional piece of overturned furniture or shattered mirror. In room 217, she found something strange, a single, untouched bed, perfectly made, with a suitcase sitting neatly on the dresser. She opened it, her curiosity outweighing her fear. Inside were clothes, neatly folded, and a journal with the initials LH embossed on the cover. She flipped it open. The first few pages were mundane, descriptions of hikes, meals, and swimming in the lake. But as she skimmed further, the entries grew frantic. "Something is wrong here. I hear them at night. Whispering, scratching. I thought I was imagining it, but the others hear it too. They took Marcy. She was here and then gone. No one talks about it. They pretend it didn't happen. But I know. I saw the thing in the woods." The final entry was scrawled so chaotically it was almost illegible. "It comes from the lake. Don't go near the lake. Don't look into the water. If you see your reflection, run." Evelyn's heart raced as she flipped to the back, but the rest of the journal was blank. She packed it into her bag, deciding to leave the room immediately. As she stepped into the hallway, the air grew colder. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and a low, distant hum vibrated through the building. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was organic, like a deep, resonant growl. She aimed her camera down the corridor, its night vision illuminating the dark. At the far end, a figure stood in the shadows. Evelyn's breath hitched. It was tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its face was a pale, featureless oval. Who's there?" she stammered, stepping back. The figure tilted its head, its movements jerky and unnatural. Then, without warning, it sprinted toward her. Evelyn screamed, dropping her camera as she fled. She didn't stop until she reached the lobby, her chest heaving and legs shaking. Grabbing her gear, she bolted out the door and into the forest. The path back to her car was gone. The trail she'd followed so carefully was now a maze of identical trees, twisting and closing in around her. Panic set in as she stumbled through the woods, the distant hum following her like a predator's growl. Then she saw it, the lake. Its surface was eerily still, reflecting the crescent moon above. Despite the warning in the journal, something compelled her to approach. As she neared the edge, she saw her reflection in the water. But it wasn't her. The face staring back was smiling, a wide, unnatural grin that stretched too far. It raised a hand, and so did she, though she hadn't moved. The reflection's grin widened, its eyes hollowing into black voids. It lunged upward, breaking the surface of the water, and Evelyn's world went dark. The next morning, a group of hikers found Evelyn's car parked at the edge of the woods, her gear neatly packed inside. No trace of her was ever found. A week later, her final video uploaded to her channel. The footage showed Evelyn wandering the resort, her commentary cheerful and oblivious. But something was wrong. In every shot, just at the edge of the frame, a pale, featureless figure loomed, watching. The video ended with Evelyn staring into the lake, her reflection smiling as it whispered, "Stay with me."
Story number 6.
The Widow's Lantern Inn sat at the edge of Blackthorn Bay, its silhouette jagged against the stormy sky. Sailors once called it a beacon of hope, its lantern-lit tower guiding them safely to shore. But now the inn was a forgotten relic, closed for decades after a string of mysterious disappearances. Locals claimed the lantern still lit itself some nights, though no one dared confirm it. For Sarah and her friends, the ghost stories were exactly why they'd come. A weekend getaway to the abandoned inn was the perfect chance to debunk the legends, or at least post some eerie pictures on social media. Armed with flashlights and a cooler of beer, they climbed the crumbling staircase to the inn's massive oak doors. "This place is a dump," said Jake, kicking aside a piece of broken wood. "It's atmospheric," Sarah corrected, snapping a photo of the ornate, dust-covered chandelier. "It's perfect." Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of salt and decay. The inn's once luxurious decor was faded, its furniture overturned, and the wallpaper shredded in long, jagged strips. At the center of the room stood a spiral staircase, its railing carved with intricate patterns of waves and ships. Above, the widow's lantern glimmered faintly, though no one had been there to light it. "Let's go up to the tower," Sarah suggested. "That's where all the ghost stories happen." "Bad idea," Rachel muttered, hugging her jacket tighter. "Every movie starts like this." "Relax," Sarah said, leading the way. "We'll be fine." The stairs groaned under their weight, each step feeling more precarious than the last. The group finally reached the lantern room, a circular space with windows on all sides. The lantern sat in the center, its glass cracked but intact. To their surprise, the wick was freshly lit, the flames steady despite the drafty air. "That's not possible," Jake said, leaning closer. "There's no one here." "Maybe the stories are true," Sarah teased, filming the lantern with her phone. "The widow of Blackthorn Bay, still waiting for her lost husband." "You mean the lady who supposedly drowned herself?" Rachel asked, glancing nervously at the foggy windows. "Yeah," Sarah said. "They say her ghost lights the lantern to lure sailors to their deaths." "Charming," Jake muttered. Suddenly, the lantern's flame flared, bright enough to force them to shield their eyes. The windows rattled violently, and the room filled with a deafening hum like the roar of a distant storm. "What the hell is that?" Rachel screamed. The fog outside thickened, swirling like a living thing. Shapes began to form in the mist, shadows of figures, their outlines jagged and incomplete. One by one, they pressed against the windows, their hands slamming against the glass. "We need to leave," Jake shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm. But the staircase was gone. Instead, the trap door they'd entered through now opened into a black void, endless and pulsing like a heartbeat. A low, mournful wail rose from the depths, sending chills through their bodies. Sarah stumbled back, her flashlight beam darting wildly. "This isn't happening," she whispered. The lantern's light dimmed, its flame shrinking until it was no larger than a pinprick. In its place, a figure began to form, tall and cloaked in black, its face hidden beneath a tattered veil. The widow. Her voice was a low hiss, carried on the wind that now howled through the room. "He never came back. Why should you?" Rachel screamed as one of the shadowy figures smashed through the window, its formless hands clawing at her. The others watched in horror as she was dragged toward the void, her cries echoing and then cutting off abruptly as she disappeared. Jake grabbed the lantern, throwing it at the widow. The flame extinguished, plunging the room into darkness. But it didn't stop her. Her veil lifted, revealing a face that wasn't a face at all, just an expanse of darkness, infinite and hungry. Sarah turned and ran blindly, her hands scraping against the cold walls as she searched for an escape. She tripped and fell hard, her flashlight skittering away. When she looked up, she saw Jake standing at the edge of the void. "Don't," she begged. "Jake, don't move." But it wasn't Jake anymore. His body stood rigid, his head tilted unnaturally to one side. Slowly, he turned to face her, his eyes empty pits of black. A grin spread across his face, too wide, too sharp. "She's waiting for you," he said, his voice layered with whispers. Sarah screamed as the shadows closed in, dragging her into the void. The next morning, the widow's lantern inn stood quiet and lifeless once again. The lantern flickered faintly in the tower, its flame untouched by human hands. When Sarah's phone was found days later, the last video showed her group climbing the spiral staircase, laughing and teasing. But in the reflection of the lantern's glass, a veiled figure stood behind them, watching.
Story number 7.
The Hollowbrook Asylum had been abandoned for decades, its crumbling walls and rusted gates standing as a monument to the horrors it once contained. Locals whispered of inhumane experiments, patients who vanished without explanation, and a malevolent presence that lingered long after the asylum closed its doors. Despite the warnings, thrill seekers and ghost hunters often snuck in, though many left terrified or not at all. Emma wasn't afraid of the asylum. As a paranormal investigator, she had faced countless haunted places and exposed them as nothing more than urban legends. Hollowbrook was her next target, a chance to document another overhyped story. Armed with her camera, a flashlight, and a recorder, she entered through a hole in the rusted gate, her breath visible in the chilly autumn air. The asylum loomed ahead, its broken windows like empty eye sockets staring into the night. Vines crawled up the sides of the building, their tendrils curling into cracks and fissures. As Emma stepped inside, the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional drip of water echoing through the empty halls. She set up her equipment in the main corridor, the walls covered in peeling paint and graffiti. Her flashlight revealed an old nurse's station, its desk littered with yellowed papers. Picking one up, she squinted at the faded writing. Patient number 327, exhibiting extreme paranoia and aggression, claims to hear the hollow ones whispering in the walls. Emma felt a chill but brushed it off. It was just a spooky story, a remnant of the asylum's dark past. She hit record on her camera and began narrating. Tonight, we're exploring Hollowbrook Asylum, a place infamous for its eerie legends. Some claim to hear whispers, others say they've seen shadowy figures in the halls. Let's see if we can find any evidence of the paranormal. As she moved deeper into the asylum, the air grew colder. Her flashlight beam flickered, casting jittery shadows on the walls. She entered the recreation room, where dusty chairs sat in a circle, their fabric torn and stained. In the corner stood a piano, its keys yellowed and warped. Emma approached it, running her fingers lightly across the keys. A single discordant note rang out, echoing through the room. She froze. That note shouldn't have played. The piano's strings had been removed long ago, as she'd read in her research. The recorder in her pocket crackled to life, emitting a low, distorted whisper. She pulled it out, her heart racing as she played back the audio. The whisper was faint but unmistakable. "Leave." Emma's breath hitched, but she forced herself to continue. "Probably just interference," she muttered, though she didn't believe it. She climbed the stairs to the second floor, each step groaning under her weight. The hallway stretched endlessly, lined with patient rooms. Most were empty, their doors hanging off their hinges, but one door stood closed at the far end. Unlike the others, it was pristine, its wood unscarred, its handle polished. Drawn by curiosity, Emma approached the door. As her hand reached for the handle, she felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. Her chest tightened and the air around her seemed to hum with energy. She opened the door. Inside was a single hospital bed, its sheets neatly tucked as if waiting for a new patient. On the wall above the bed, words were scrawled in red. "The hollow ones are here." Emma's flashlight flickered violently, then went out completely. She fumbled for her spare, but before she could turn it on, she heard it, soft, shuffling footsteps coming from behind her. She spun around, but the hallway was empty. The footsteps grew louder, joined by faint whispers that seemed to come from all directions. She backed into the room, her heart pounding. The bed creaked, and she turned just in time to see the sheets slowly pulling themselves back, as though inviting her to lie down. "Nope," she whispered, bolting for the door. But as she reached the hallway, she stopped cold. The asylum had changed. The walls were no longer crumbling and graffiti-covered. They were pristine, painted a sickly green, and the air smelled of antiseptic. Distant screams and laughter echoed through the halls, accompanied by the metallic clang of doors slamming shut. "Hello?" Emma called, her voice trembling. A figure appeared at the end of the hallway. It was a patient, clad in a tattered hospital gown, its head hanging at an unnatural angle. The figure began to move toward her, its steps uneven and jerky. As it drew closer, Emma saw its face, or what should have been a face. Instead, there was only smooth, featureless skin. Panicking, she turned and ran, the whispers growing louder and more frantic. The asylum seemed to twist around her, corridors looping back on themselves, doors leading to nowhere. She stumbled into the main lobby, her chest heaving, only to find the pristine nurse's station once again occupied. Behind the desk sat a woman in an old-fashioned uniform, her face pale and expressionless. "Checking out already?" the woman asked, her voice devoid of emotion. Emma stammered, backing away. "I have to leave." The nurse's lips curled into a smile, revealing sharp, blackened teeth. "No one leaves Hollowbrook." The walls began to pulse, dark shadows emerging from them like living things. They moved toward Emma, their forms flickering and shifting. Hands reached for her, pulling her into the suffocating darkness. The next day, Emma's equipment was found neatly packed outside the asylum's gates, her car parked nearby. But of Emma herself, there was no trace. Weeks later, her final video uploaded to her channel. It showed her walking through the asylum, speaking confidently into the camera. But in the background, barely visible at first, the shadows began to move. In the last frame, Emma turned to the camera, her face pale and smooth, her voice whispering, "The hollow ones are waiting."
Story number 8.
The Black Willow Manor had always been a place of whispered fears. Perched on a hilltop overlooking the small town of Ravensfield, its towering gables and grotesque gargoyles seemed to watch over the town like a silent sentinel. The manor had been abandoned for over a century, following the mysterious disappearance of the Hargrave family. The rumors varied: curses, madness, unspeakable rituals, but one thing was certain. Anyone who entered the manor never came out the same. Samantha, a skeptic with a taste for the macabre, decided to investigate. She had spent years debunking supernatural myths on her podcast, and Black Willow was her ultimate challenge. Armed with recording equipment, a sturdy flashlight, and her unshakable doubt, she arrived on a moonless night, the manor looming like a dark cathedral against the sky. The air grew colder as she approached the massive front doors, their once ornate carvings faded and splintered. A tarnished brass knocker in the shape of a screaming face greeted her. She hesitated for a moment, then rapped it 3 times. The sound echoed unnaturally, as though the house itself were alive. When the door creaked open on its own, Samantha chuckled nervously into her recorder. "Classic haunted house move," she said. "Let's see what else this place has in store." The foyer was cavernous, with a grand staircase spiraling into darkness. A massive chandelier hung above, its crystals coated in decades of dust. The walls were lined with faded portraits of the Hargrave family, their eyes seeming to follow her as she moved. As Samantha began her tour, she noted the eeriness of the silence. No wind, no creaking floorboards, just an oppressive, suffocating stillness. She entered the dining room, where a long table sat beneath a cracked mirror. The table was set for dinner, the silverware tarnished, the plates empty but arranged as if expecting guests. "This is creepy," she admitted, her voice softer now. Her flashlight's beam swept across the room and landed on a painting above the fireplace, a portrait of a woman in a black gown, her expression severe. In her hands, she held a willow branch, its leaves painted with unsettling detail. The moment Samantha's light hit the painting, a faint sound broke the silence. A soft rustling, like leaves brushing against each other. But there were no trees inside. "Wind," she whispered, turning to check the windows. They were sealed shut, their panes frosted over from the inside. The rustling grew louder, and this time it was accompanied by a soft, rhythmic tapping. She followed the sound to a nearby door, which led to the manor's library. The room was enormous, with shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with decaying books. In the center of the room stood a large writing desk, and on it sat an open book. The tapping continued, coming from the desk itself. Samantha approached cautiously. The book's pages were blank, but the tapping grew faster, louder, as if urging her to act. Against her better judgment, she reached out to touch the book. The moment her fingers brushed the paper, the room plunged into darkness. Samantha's flashlight flickered, barely illuminating the space. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. She backed toward the door, her heart pounding. Then the whispers became words. "She is watching. She is waiting." Samantha spun around, her flashlight beam landing on the portrait of the woman in black. Only now the woman's face had changed. Her eyes were wide and staring, her lips twisted into a cruel smile. The willow branch in her hands seemed to sway, its leaves trembling. The air grew colder, and Samantha saw her breath fog in front of her. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the entire house. Her recorder crackled to life, emitting distorted static. In the static, she heard faint sobbing, then a child's voice. "Don't let her take you." "Who? Who's there?" Samantha demanded, her voice trembling. The whispering returned, louder now, overlapping voices chanting the same phrase, "The willow bends, and so will you." The chandelier above her groaned, its chains creaking. Samantha looked up just as it began to sway violently, the crystals clinking together like sinister wind chimes. She dove out of the way as it crashed to the floor, shattering into countless shards. The library's books began to fall from the shelves, their pages fluttering like birds. One struck her shoulder, and she noticed the cover bore the same willow branch from the painting. The whispers intensified, and the room began to distort, the walls stretching, the floor tilting. She bolted for the staircase, desperate to find a way out. As she climbed, she heard footsteps behind her, heavy, deliberate, and impossibly fast. She dared a glance back and froze. The woman from the painting was there, standing at the base of the stairs. Her black gown flowed as though caught in an unseen wind, and her willow branch writhed like a living thing. Her smile was wider now, impossibly so, revealing jagged teeth. "Stay," the woman hissed, her voice echoing like a storm. Samantha screamed and ran, but the staircase seemed endless. Her legs burned as she climbed, and the air grew heavier with each step. Finally, she reached the top, bursting into an attic room filled with cobwebs and old furniture. There was a window, a way out. She ran to it, throwing it open to the night air. Below her was a sheer drop, but anything was better than staying in the manor. As she climbed onto the ledge, a hand cold as death gripped her ankle. She looked down to see the woman's face, now inches from her own, her eyes blazing like embers. "The willow bends," she whispered, "and now so do you." Samantha screamed as she was pulled back into the darkness. The next morning, Black Willow Manor stood as silent and foreboding as ever. Samantha's equipment was found on the hill outside, her recorder still running. The last sound captured was a soft rustling, like leaves in the wind, and a single whispered phrase, "She never lets them go."
Story number 9.
The Cradle of Shadows was an antique shop hidden in a forgotten alley of the city. Its windows were grimy, its sign faded, and yet something about it seemed to beckon to those who passed. Most ignored the feeling, quickening their pace as they walked by. But those who entered were never quite the same. Charlotte wasn't looking for trouble, she was looking for something unique. A vintage enthusiast and occasional collector, she had stumbled upon the shop by accident. She pushed open the heavy door, a bell jingling softly above her. The air inside was thick with the scent of old wood and mildew. The shop was cluttered, every surface crammed with objects from eras long past. Dolls with cracked porcelain faces sat side by side with tarnished silverware, faded photographs, and strange trinkets whose purposes were long forgotten. In the center of it all stood a rocking cradle, its dark wood polished to an unnatural shine. Charlotte's eyes were drawn to the cradle immediately. It was simple yet elegant, its craftsmanship far superior to anything else in the shop. A black lace veil hung over it, concealing whatever lay inside. "You have an eye for the unusual," came a raspy voice behind her. Charlotte jumped, turning to see an elderly woman emerge from the shadows. Her eyes were sharp, glittering like black diamonds beneath her hood. "This cradle," Charlotte began, gesturing toward it. "It's beautiful. How much is it?" The woman tilted her head as if considering Charlotte. "It's not for sale," she said, her tone flat. Charlotte frowned. "Then why is it here?" "Some things are meant to stay where they are," the woman replied cryptically. "But if you're determined, take it. No charge." A chill ran through Charlotte, but her curiosity outweighed her unease. She had to know more about the cradle. She nodded, and the woman carefully wrapped the cradle in an old quilt before handing it over. As Charlotte left the shop, she glanced back. The woman was watching her from the doorway, her expression unreadable. At home, Charlotte placed the cradle in her living room, intending to clean it before deciding where to display it. She removed the lace veil, revealing a small, worn teddy bear lying inside. Its glass eyes stared up at her, and she felt a pang of sadness for the forgotten toy. That night, as Charlotte sat reading in her armchair, she heard it, the soft creak of wood, as if the cradle were rocking on its own. She looked up, but it was still. "Must be the wind," she muttered, though the windows were closed. The creaking continued the next night, louder this time. When Charlotte approached the cradle, she saw the teddy bear had shifted positions, its tiny arms now stretched outward. Her stomach tightened, but she laughed it off, blaming her imagination. By the third night, sleep was impossible. The cradle rocked incessantly, the creaking mingling with faint whispers that seemed to come from the walls. Exhausted and unnerved, Charlotte decided to return the cradle to the shop, but the shop was gone. The alley where it had been was empty, the building replaced by a crumbling wall covered in ivy. Panicked, Charlotte hurried home, only to find the cradle no longer in her living room. It was upstairs, in her bedroom, rocking slowly. "Enough," she said aloud, her voice shaking. She grabbed the cradle and carried it into the backyard, intending to burn it. But as she struck the match, a child's cry rang out, sharp and piercing. Charlotte froze. The cry came again, this time from the cradle itself. The teddy bear's head turned toward her, its glass eyes now glowing with a sickly green light. "Please don't." A small voice whimpered. It was a child's voice, trembling with fear. Charlotte's hands trembled. Who are you?" The bear's mouth didn't move, but the voice replied, "They won't let me go." "Who?" Charlotte demanded. Before the voice could answer, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. Shadows spilled out from the cradle, twisting and writhing like smoke. They formed shapes, faces contorted in anguish, hands reaching out as if desperate for salvation. "They took me," the voice said, now echoing from all around her. "And now, they'll take you." The shadows lunged, wrapping around Charlotte like cold, wet vines. She screamed, trying to break free, but they pulled her toward the cradle. The last thing she saw was the teddy bear's face, its glass eyes flashing with triumph. The next day, neighbors reported strange noises coming from Charlotte's house, but when the police arrived, they found it empty. The only thing left behind was the cradle, now sitting in the center of the living room. Inside it lay the teddy bear, its arms cradling a new object, a small photo of Charlotte, her face frozen in an expression of terror. The cradle eventually found its way back to the shop, waiting for its next owner. And the alley, as always, remained hidden, until it decided to call someone else inside.
Story number 10.
The train station at Black Hollow was a forgotten relic. Its iron gates were rusted shut, its tracks overgrown with weeds, and its platform crumbled at the edges. It had been abandoned for decades, ever since the derailment of the Midnight Line, a passenger train that vanished on its way to the city. Every October, rumors surfaced about strange sounds and ghostly lights near the station, but no one dared to investigate. No one. Except for Daniel. Daniel was a journalist chasing his next big story. He had heard the legends about Black Hollow Station and dismissed them as local folklore. Determined to uncover the truth, he packed his camera, a flashlight, and a recorder and set off on a chilly October night. When he arrived, the station was cloaked in a dense fog. The skeletal remains of the platform jutted out into the darkness, and the air carried the faint scent of smoke and decay. A faded sign above the entrance read, Black Hollow Station, Est 1898. "This is it," Daniel muttered, stepping onto the platform. His boots crunched on the gravel as he set up his camera. "Let's see if there's anything to these stories." He began walking along the tracks, shining his flashlight into the fog. The silence was unsettling, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Just as he was about to turn back, he heard it, the distant whistle of a train. Daniel froze. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails. But there was no train in sight. His pulse quickened as he scanned the tracks, his flashlight beam cutting through the mist. Then, out of the fog, the train appeared. The Midnight Line was unlike any train Daniel had ever seen. Its black iron exterior was polished to a sinister shine, and its windows glowed with an eerie, pulsating light. It rolled to a stop in front of him, its doors hissing open. Cold air rushed out, carrying the faint smell of burning coal. Daniel hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to run. But curiosity won out. He stepped onto the train, his flashlight flickering as he crossed the threshold. Inside, the train was deathly silent. The seats were empty, their fabric worn and stained. Dust motes floated in the air, disturbed by his movements. He began exploring the car, his footsteps echoing down the narrow aisle. "Hello?" he called, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is anyone here?" There was no response. As he moved deeper into the train, the air grew colder. His breath fogged in front of him, and the flashlight dimmed further. He reached the next car, its door creaking open with a sound like a dying groan. This car was different. It was filled with passengers, or what was left of them. Figures sat slumped in the seats, their clothes tattered and covered in soot. Their faces were skeletal, hollow eyes staring into nothingness. Daniel's heart pounded as he realized they weren't moving, not even breathing. He raised his camera, snapping a photo. The flash lit up the car for a brief moment, and he saw something he hadn't noticed before. Every figure was holding a ticket, their skeletal hands clutching the slips of paper as if their lives depended on it. The train lurched forward. Daniel stumbled, grabbing onto a seat for balance. The train was moving, accelerating down the tracks. He ran to the nearest window, but the world outside was a blur of darkness and light. He tried the doors, but they wouldn't budge. Panic set in. He turned back to the passengers, but now their heads were all turned toward him. Their hollow eyes burned with faint blue flames, and their mouths opened in silent screams. "What do you want?" Daniel shouted, his voice cracking. A shadow moved at the far end of the car. It was a figure in a conductor's uniform, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. The figure began walking toward him, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. Daniel backed away, his mind racing. He grabbed his recorder, his voice trembling. "This is Daniel Hayes. I'm on the Midnight Line. There are passengers, but they're not alive. The train is moving, and I don't know where it's taking me. If anyone hears this, please." The recorder was ripped from his hands. He looked up to see the conductor standing inches away. The man's face was a grotesque mask of charred flesh, his eyes glowing with the same blue fire as the passengers. "Tickets, please," the conductor rasped, his voice like grinding metal. "I don't have a ticket," Daniel stammered. The conductor's twisted grin widened. "Then you'll have to stay." The passengers began to rise, their skeletal forms creaking and cracking as they moved. They surrounded Daniel, their bony hands reaching for him. He screamed as the shadows engulfed him. The next morning, the fog lifted from Black Hollow Station, leaving it as silent and desolate as ever. Daniel's car was found parked nearby, his equipment left untouched. On the seat of the car was a single train ticket, stamped with the words, "One Way, Midnight Line." Local legends say that if you listen closely on October nights, you can hear the faint whistle of the Midnight Line echoing through the fog, and sometimes, if you're brave or foolish, you might even see the train, but those who board it are never seen again.